And I'd like to start off by thanking the Laurier Center for the Study of Canada for their partnership with our military lecture series and helping bring Paul into us tonight. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that Guelph is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Through the Between the Lakes Purchase No. 3 Treaty of 1792, the Mississaugas of the Credit ceded to the British Crown over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Huron, Ontario, and Erie. Today, Guelph is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Guelph Museums continues to build our knowledge and relationships about the land, its history, and its peoples, and this commitment informs all that we do at Guelph Museums. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul. Paul Esau is a PhD candidate for the Laurier. He's in the history department. He's interned with several Canadian peace and disarmament organizations, including Project Plowshares and the Canadian Landmines Foundation, and teaches classes on nuclear, chemical, biological, and conventional arms control. He lives in Kitchener with his wife Heidi and their hedgehog Juniper, and I don't think he brought Juniper today.
We were thinking about it around here.
Well, thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you. The hedgehog would have upstaged me, so decided to leave her at home. But thank you to the museum, first of all, and also to Bill for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I guess, Matt Baker for being here, and Heidi for tolerating my talk one more time. Just heard it a couple times already. So I'm talking today about Canadian military export policy, and I'll say in advance that I'm kind of focusing on the beginning and the end of this period, not much in the middle. If you wanted a 2-hour talk, we can talk about the middle as well, but you probably don't want that, so we'll stay away from it for now. When I give talks like this, I always start by talking about the thing that's on the truck in this image here, which some of you may know is a light armored vehicle. It's produced in London, Ontario by General Dynamics. And I start by talking about the most recent lab deal. So in 2014, as many of you well know, the Harper government announced the largest, I shouldn't name this thing here, the Harper government announced the largest arms export deal in Canadian history in the post-war period. And that was a $14.8 billion agreement for the supply and maintenance of over 900 light armored vehicles, or labs. And they were being sold to Saudi Arabia, obviously. Since then, this deal has inspired a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism for a number of reasons. That includes the fact, as on the left side of the slide here, it actually turned Canada into the second largest arms dealer to the Middle East for a temporary period of time in 2018-19. On the right side of the slide, you see a piece from a report from the UN, and I guess the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, and Canada was cited for being responsible for helping aid and abet the Saudi Arabian war in Yemen, which began also in 2014. And there's other kind of notable highlights as well in this saga. These are photos taken from video of Canadian-made labs that were destroyed by Houthi forces in Yemen. So we have evidence of these labs being used across the border in this war, which has been criticized by both the UN and also other international authorities. And in 2015, Justin Trudeau on the campaign trail called these Jeeps. They're not quite Jeeps, as you can see. You probably could buy one of these and drive it around in downtown Guelph. I'd love to see you try, but let me know how it turns out. There's significant ordnance on the front, obviously, and they would not be road legal in most jurisdictions in Canada. Maybe so, I don't know, but I would assume not. Also, of course, there was the dismemberment of Adnan Khashoggi in a Turkish embassy, but that's a whole different story. We won't get into that. Now, as you can see here on this graph, this is the increase in military exports by region from Canada, excluding exports to the US, and the red is exports to the military exports, to the Middle East, and most of that red is to Saudi Arabia, and most of what's going to Saudi Arabia is light armored vehicles during this period. So as you can see, it more than triples from 2006 and 2019, and that's largely because of the lab deal. And of course, the Saudis stopped paying for a while, but that's kind of a different story. So I always lead with this story because I really want to talk about how many journalists, academics, and historians, and others, and critics, I guess, analysts have criticize these deals as hypocritical in various ways, unethical, incompatible with Canadian values and foreign policy, and of questionable long-term benefit. However, as you guys know, values and ethics and morals are all kind of wishy-washy subjective things, and what these different critics are actually talking about are whether or not the lab deal is congruent with Canadian military export policy. And policy itself in Canada is a complicated mixture of a number of things on military exports. It's a mixture of international obligations, unilateral guidelines, and bureaucratic structures that relate to export of military equipment from Canada via a system of government permits. So if you wanted to sell something, export something from Canada that you happen to own, say you had your own Sherman tank or whatever, I'm just lying around, you have to get a military permit or export permit from the government to be able to export it. And how is this policy actually broken down as different components in Canada? Well, this is a very small print, so I apologize for that. I should have made it bigger. There is a legislative aspect, the Export and Import Permits Act, which was passed in 1948. It's been amended numerous times since. That kind of dictates what military equipment actually is. So what the list of those things is, how you get permits, and also how you go about kind of controlling the system of exports from Canada. You have external obligations that Canada accedes to. Things like during the Cold War, we were a member of SOCOM, and that was a secret kind of organization for preventing the sales of military equipment, strategic equipment from Canada to communist countries. And that became the Boston Arrangement in 1996, and then in 2019 we joined the Arms Trade Treaty, which is a more contemporary organization to try to create more transparency and responsibility around the arms trade globally. But we also have what I like to call internal restrictions, so kind of the guidelines that Canadian officials in the government use to decide whether they should say yes or no to certain military export applications. And in 1986, one of the more recent kind of iterations of restrictions was passed. It was actually announced by Joe Clark, who gave it to the public and made it public. And this kind of has 4 key components or criteria to it. So as you can see, we try not to export. We either usually don't, or we closely control. The language is kind of variable. Military exports to countries that pose a threat to Canada, countries that are involved in or under imminent threat of hostilities, countries that are under UN sanctions or embargoes. And then the 4th criteria is kind of a mishmash of 2 different things. It has a human rights component and a component about the type of military equipment. So is it offensive, is it going to be used to kill people or to repress domestic populations, or is it more kind of benign? Like, are you selling personal body armor, or are you selling surface-to-air missiles, or are you selling cruise missiles? There's a big difference in how we interpret applications based upon what they actually are. And where am I in this one now? Yeah, so I think that I start with this when I talk about this topic because I want to think about how a Saudi lab deal is in violation of a couple of those criteria normally. Saudi Arabia is not a country that has a great human rights record. It's not a country that is at peace currently. It's actually involved in several different wars over the past couple of decades. And it's a country that is an ally to Canada in some ways and also a threat in others. So it technically violates those criteria. And I always talk about the idea that in Canada we have what I call a policy praxis gap in our military export policy. How our policy is written, how we articulate it to the public is somewhat different. There's a gap between that and how we actually implement our policy and the things that we actually sell in practice and our record of sales over the past 70 years now. So I want to talk about how this policy practice gap developed and then kind of give my impression, which is that the Saudi lab deal in 2014 is an example of general trends in military export policy in Canada. It's not an exception to the rule. It's not an embarrassing failure of our policy. It actually kind of is how our policy is meant to operate and how our policy has been created to operate. So let's get into the 3 parts of this presentation. I want to talk about today the genesis of military export policy, some of the restrictions and how they've evolved over time from 45 onward, and then a little bit about the first Saudi lab sale, which actually occurred in 1991. So let's look at the genesis first. Do any of you know who this bad hombre is? Have you seen this face before? Anybody? No? Okay. If you were alive in about 1934, we'll say, this would be an infamous face that you would be very much aware of, because this is Mr. Sir Basil Zaharoff. And Basil Zaharoff, according to the Smithsonian Magazine, is, quote, an arsonist, a bigamist and pimp, an arms dealer, an honorary knight of the British Empire, a confidant of kings, and an all-around international man of mystery. And he's infamous during this period because he is the epiphany of the private arms dealer. And after the First World War, in the interwar period, there's a significant public backlash in the West against figures like this. And now often they're private arms producers, like major industries like Krupp's maybe in Germany, or Vickers in the UK, or DuPont in the US, that were kind of blamed by the population for either causing the First World War, or extending the First World War, or selling to both sides, and therefore causing greater loss of life during the First World War. Now, the truth of some of those accusations is, I would say, not well-founded, and of course, a lot of the stories about this guy are also kind of pseudepigraphal, because he burned his diaries before he died and was very good at lying about things, so we like telling stories about him. Did he actually seduce like 17 Soviet ballerinas? I don't know. Wouldn't be certain time. But like, you know, the stories get bigger as they get told, and this guy has a lot of stories about him. He also becomes very important in popular culture. Down here, this is an Adventures of Tintin panel, which you may have heard of, very popular 20th century French-drawn comic strip. He appears as Basil Bazarov trying to sell arms to somebody in that comic strip. And this represents, in some ways, the suspicion that also was in Canada about the military export policy, or sorry, I guess the arms trade, and about private arms sales specifically. And we did not want to be people who either supported or endorsed the accumulation of profits based upon the arms trade. And there were all sorts of stories about these kind of sordid arms dealers. This is a story from Maclean's called Salesmen of Death, The Truth About the War Makers. Very popular stuff. There's a book called The Merchants of Death, which becomes almost household reading in Canada. I mean, I wouldn't say household reading, but it was very prominent in Canada. It was mentioned in Parliament numerous times, and there was a real concern that Canada should not become involved in the arms trade after the First World War. Luckily, as this timeline shows, look at damn, I should have made these fonts bigger, I'm sorry about that. In 1918, after the First World War and Canada demobilizes, it demobilizes almost everything. There is very little military production left in Canada, as many of you will know. We produce almost nothing. There is not a working tank in Canada until the Second World War, and there is very little modern pieces of aircraft and or naval vessels. And so Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, down here on the left, is able to go to the League of Nations at numerous points and be like, it's all of you. It's all of you that are the problem. You're the ones selling arms. In Canada, we're pure, we have no weapons, we're better than you. And he likes doing that. He's a guy who kind of, in Canada's known in some ways a reputation for being holier than thou, being inside of the angels, being a little moralistic. And this works really well until the later 30s, when there is war on the horizon in Europe, and the British are looking to rearm, and Mackenzie King goes, oh my gosh, we better start mobilizing as well, because there's going to be this war with, there might be a war in Europe, but we should probably develop some kind of military capability. And so in Canada, we start looking at the idea of potentially producing arms from private manufacturers for sale to the British as part of their rearmament program. The public is very suspicious about this. And so when we create the actual foundations for the system in 1937, which is when we pass the first military export policy controls in Parliament, Mackenzie King says that these controls are actually to prevent the smuggling of military equipment out of Canada to the Spanish Republicans. The Spanish Civil War is going on at this time as well, and this is the ostensible reason for creating military export controls. Now, before the war, we exported very little to the British. We had a couple of small contracts for the production of Sten guns and some anti-aircraft ammunition, but obviously during the war, Canada becomes a major military producer. By 1945, we become a very prominent producer for the Allies. About 70% of what we produce is sent overseas in the form of mutual aid for like our allies in the war, and therefore we become a pretty significant military exporter, though always obviously for our troops or for our allied troops in wartime. At the end of the war, though, this means that Canada is left with a bunch of surplus military equipment, right? We produced a ton of things, the war is winding down, a lot of that equipment is left in Canadian depots in Europe or else in Canada, and like every other country, we're going to try to deal with the problem of trying to get rid of this stuff, trying to recoup some of the costs of having produced thousands and thousands of aircraft and naval vessels and guns and millions of rounds of ammunition. And this is left up to the responsibility of the Department of Munitions and Supply in Canada during the war, and also what we call the War Assets Corporation, which is a corporate crown entity which is responsible for trying to sell stuff off or trying to get rid of stuff. So they recycle some war surplus, they dump some of it in the ocean. If you've read Alex Suchin's book, War Junk, then you know that a lot of the stuff gets dumped in the ocean. Some of it gets broken down and repurposed, and some of it gets sold and exported to other countries. And so over the course of this period, we start selling to like our allies like the Dutch in 1945, which becomes a bit of a mess because the Dutch want to use it all to repress an Indonesian independence movement in their colony in the East Indies, and of course that's not very popular on the world stage, and so a lot of Canadian politicians get in some flack for being the ones who are arming the Dutch against an indigenous Indonesian population. We end up selling to the Chinese nationalists, which also gets our government in some flack with both internationally and also in Canada, because Chinese nationalists are fighting the communists, which is good, but they're also not exactly the friendliest, most democratic, and most just society at the time under Chiang Kai-shek. And then we have the passage of the Legislative Export and Import Permits Act in 1947, which is the beginning of legislative basis for military export controls in Canada. And then in 1948, you have the first sales from Canada of military equipment from current production. Prior to that point, we're selling almost everything from war surplus. In 48, the government says, hey, we can make some money doing this. Why don't we start producing weapons and ammunition in Canada from the Dominion Arsenal and from Valcartier, and we can start selling them abroad, and that will subsidize further military production as we begin to kind of rearm for the Cold War. Right? Like, things are happening in 48 that look pretty, negative on the world stage. And our, I guess, Mackenzie King at that time and the potential new premier, St. Laurent, were kind of worried about Canada's military capability. So between, I guess I would say that between 46 and 49, Canada goes from being a producer of military equipment only for its close allies and only really during wartime, to all of a sudden selling to a lot of different people who are not really always allies in the traditional sense, and of equipment that is from current production as opposed to from wartime production. And this is after, obviously, the population being very much kind of against the arms trade in the 20s and 30s. And where do I want to go with this? So, let's look at this a little bit first. If you're a visual person, you want to know what I mean by the system for military exports. This is kind of how it operates. If you're an exporter who wants to export your Sherman tank, you put a little application, you write it out, you give it to the Department of Trade and Commerce. They boot it off to the Department of External Affairs, who goes to the Economic Division, and they ask for assessments from both the Geographic Divisions and D&D. D&D for kind of strategic advice, like, will that export give a huge capability to a certain country? The Geographic Divisions to ask if you want to export to, I don't know, say Pakistan or Israel, is that going to cause political problems? Once they made a decision, it goes back to the External Affairs, who either send it off back to Trade and Commerce, who give you a response, either yay or nay, or if it's a really kind of controversial destination or a controversial product, it might go up to the Undersecretary or Cabinet to make an executive call. So a lot of things we're talking about today either went to Cabinet or were decided, obviously, at the Geographic Divisions, but this is the system and kind of how it operates in this time period. With some exceptions, there are kind of quibbles and changes over time, but this is the system. So the genesis of military export policy, as I said, we become a substantial producer of military equipment in the Second World War. We start selling to subsidize our military industrial base in the late 40s, and Canadians are very suspicious about arms trade during the 20s and 30s. Moving on to export restrictions. So we talked about some of these at the beginning, the things that internally kind of decide where we sell and why. And I would say that during the 40s, as we begin trying to figure out our military export policy, the government starts putting into place, coming up with ideas for what restrictions should be. There's this revolving carousel of ideas of where we should sell and why we should sell and who we should sell to and what kind of our moral sort of foundations are. And I'm going to go through a couple of these failed attempts today that were ideas that they came up with. They're like, we should try this, and it doesn't work out very well or it's not very convenient, they stop doing it. But I got to make sure I'm on the right page once again. Yes, I am. Okay, so first of all, these are the four that I kind of told you about earlier in the presentation that were passed in '86. There are a couple other little ones as well. Like one of the foundational rules is don't sell to the communists, which I'm sure you guys can all kind of understand if you lived through the Cold War. Also, you sell to governments and government agents. Canada does not approve military exports to private companies, so we aren't selling stuff to Mr. Basil Zaharoff, who's in it anyway. So we wouldn't approve an arms export to like a private arms trader. And then, of course, military export permits are always required if you want to sell things. So one of our first attempts to create a restriction on military exports is what I like to call the promise. And an example of this is that in December 1946, the Dutch requested 10,000 Sten submachine guns for use in Indonesia in that colonial conflict I was talking about. The Canadian government actually declines this one because of concerns that the sale might, quote, cause severe domestic and international criticism, end quote. You would be naive, however, to assume that this tale does not end with us selling military equipment to the Dutch. Because it does, just as a spoiler for you guys, it does. What Cabinet does is it embraces the American and British policy of evaluating military exports according to their alleged destinations. Equipment to be used by the Dutch in Europe was eligible for a permit, whereas equipment intended for use in the East Indies was not. The difference between the two was a Dutch assurance, often actually just a verbal promise, that about the end use of the equipment. So, like, for a time, the government treats these promises, which are almost nothing more than a wink and a handshake in many cases, like a magic bullet, which prevents any abuse of our military export system by the Dutch. And this is also actually used in other conflicts. So they're used to justify sales not only to the Netherlands, but also to India, to Pakistan, to Egypt, and to Israel. In 1954, Lester Pearson decides to approve an Israeli order for 48 25-pounder artillery guns, which is a pretty significant military transfer, because of a promise from the Israelis that the guns would be used to replace existing weapons in Israel. The Israeli ambassador says, don't worry, we have 48 worn-out guns. We're just going to replace your guns with the worn-out guns. No increase in military capability, so don't worry about it. Now, of course, the American intelligence services are telling Lester B. Pearson that what the Israelis are actually doing is giving the old guns to paramilitary forces in the kibbutzes. So they very much are increasing their military capacity, and yet Pearson goes, no, I trust them, and he sells these guns, right? Now, there are political reasons why you would do that, but this is the example of the promise, right? Some promises do end up becoming too hard to swallow. In 54, the Israelis promised to scrap their entire air force if Pearson will give them 24 Canadian-made F-86 jet fighters. And External Affairs finally says, you know what? That sounds a little bit too good to be true. So they don't accept that one. But in many ways, what happens is you get a series of promises that are never really verified or enforced that allow the government to be able to approve exports to controversial destinations. Which leads us to the balance of power argument. So after the 48 war, Israel and the Arab states become voracious customers for military equipment from all over the world. And at first, the major Western powers kind of collaborate to prevent any one nation from gaining a massive military advantage, right? Because the area is still technically under UN supervision. So that kind of third point I mentioned in '86 about, we don't export to areas under UN arms embargoes. The area is still kind of under a UN embargo. We kind of all decided to ignore that fact. Western solidarity, though, over this agreement kind of begins to erode at a certain point. There's so much lucrative commercial advantage to being able to sell into this area, and Canada really wants to get in on the action. So in May 1950, the US, UK, and France signed what's called the Tripartite Declaration, which is basically a promise that the three signatories are opposed to the development of an arms race in the Middle East. However, they will allow the states in the region to buy a small level of military equipment, which meets the legitimate defense requirements of that state. The UN Charter allows states under Article 51 to arm for self-defense. And so these states are saying, we'll allow Israel, Egypt, and Syria and others to buy a little bit of military equipment so they can meet their self-defense requirements. As long as the actual balance of power in the region isn't disturbed. So we don't sell enough that it causes a difference in balance of power, but we sell a little bit each. Now, as you can possibly imagine, the resulting arms race in the Middle East during this period is entirely fueled by military export deals from a number of different countries that were all justified as legitimate defense equipment to the recipient state, which maintained the balance of power. Over the next 10 or so years, all of these states quintuple their military capability based upon their maintaining the balance of power. And this basically means that Canada is justifying what is essentially, that's not a form of gun running, that's a pejorative way of phrasing it, but they're justifying selling military equipment into a conflict zone as an important contribution to global security and world peace. And we approved millions of dollars from the Canadian government of military exports into the Middle East during this period, up until level 56 in the Suez crisis. However, the balance of power is somewhat meaningless as a concept because I talked about it's very difficult to understand what the balance of power is, and also because the Western suppliers don't have a monopoly over the supply of arms into the Middle East. And so whenever somebody else sells into the region, then all of a sudden Israel, Egypt, or Syria comes back to the US or the UK or France or Canada and says, well, the Czechoslovakians just sold so-and-so, that changed the balance of power, now we need to buy some more arms. What do you got for sale, right? And they have a lot of equipment that way. In 55, for example, Nasser gets an entirely new air force in a deal with Czechoslovakia, which totally destroys the balance of power and creates an international crisis. And that kind of messes with this balance of power argument. We also have an interesting approach to human rights in Canada, a military export policy. It is interesting because in the 40s and 50s, the Canadian government's a little suspicious about human rights because Mackenzie King sees human rights originally as being kind of a potential violation of the domestic sovereignty of individual states. However, within the Department of External Affairs, you have people like Escott Reed, whose picture we saw earlier, who are very concerned about some of the criteria involving moral and ethical criteria for arms sales in general and military export policy specifically. So Escott Reed writes this pivotal memo in 1947 to the government where he says that one of the relevant considerations of Canadian export policy is whether arms supplied by Canada might be used in a way that would be repugnant to a large number of Canadians. That's a key phrase there. Repugnancy is a very good word, I like that. It implies something very visceral and negative. In pacifying rebellious colonial peoples, in a civil war in China, for example, or to countries that might change sides and become part of the communist bloc. That's a problem as well. The weird thing about this is that I think Escott Reed is trying to insinuate a kind of ethical component into military export policy. He's saying we want to avoid things that are repugnant to a number of Canadians, as an approach like Canadian moral ideal. But the government kind of treats this almost as a political relations problem. So the problem isn't there's some kind of ethical standard we should be obeying. The problem is that we need to convince Canadians they shouldn't be repulsed by a certain arms deal. Or we only really care about the ones that are repulsive to our Canadians. And you get examples of this, say in 56, when the government really, the cabinet is stressing for 6 months of whether we should sell F-86 fighter jets to Israel just prior to the Suez crisis. And they're really worried about it because a lot of Canadians are very concerned about it. There's a lot of public input from Canadians who are sending letters and writing newspapers and being very involved in this process. And yet, the government decides to sell F-86 Sabre jets to Colombia, which is also involved in some domestic conflicts at the time, very quickly, just like this. It's like, one cabinet meeting, yeah, sure, we'll sell those to Colombia, whatever. And it's because the public was very concerned about Israel in 56. They did not care less about Colombia, right? Now, the human rights criteria change over time. In 48, you have Louis Saint Laurent add this criteria to a cabinet decision where he says, we should only sell to regimes that are, quote, generally democratic, or generally speaking, democratic, end quote, which is funny to me because the very next item on the agenda at that cabinet meeting is discussion of a sale to nationalist China, which I mentioned before, is not democratic in any way, shape, or form, and that gets approved. So this probably has the record for the fastest criteria to be violated, right under 5 minutes, which is pretty remarkable for a government. In 54, we create a sensitive list of countries that kind of violate these criteria. In 76, we have a new one. In 78, we get the regime's, quote, wholly repugnant to Canadian values, end quote, which is pretty cool. So that's how that rights criteria was articulated in 78. And in 86, you get the more familiar one you guys have already seen, where we actually have a mention of human rights specifically in the ones that Joe Clark, I guess, made public in 86. And so that's kind of like how human rights criteria evolved over time. And it's an interesting sort of evolution from the moral repugnance all the way through the human rights criteria and some other stuff in the middle. Now, demilitarization. I've always liked this one, not as much as the next one, I do like this one, and that's because I think this is a really funny kind of word game government plays with itself on this topic. So after the Second World War, as I said, Canada needs to find a lot of customers for military surplus equipment. And the problem is that C.D. Howe, who most of you guys know is a Canadian figure, he's a very important minister after the war, and he's very good at making money. He realizes that making a quick buck in terms of getting rid of war surplus involves selling a lot of this equipment overseas, right? People do want it around the world, we should be selling it, and he and WAC are very much in favor of making money by selling military equipment. External Affairs, just to deal with the political consequences of military exports, is saying no, we should not be selling military equipment around the world. And so, after a couple of months of argument, they come to this interesting compromise, where the government decides that if you take a frigate, or you take a corvette, or you take an aircraft of some sort, and you take the guns off of it, and maybe the radar, maybe one of the boilers or whatever, then you've done what you call demilitarizing it. The thing is now demilitarized. If it's been demilitarized, it's no longer a piece of military equipment. It's now a piece of dual-use equipment, so that it can be used for civilian or military purposes, and therefore it can be sold as a civilian commodity. And I like this because a lot of this stuff ends up getting sold into South America to various regimes in South America, and the first thing half of these regimes do once they buy a corvette or a frigate or something is request from the Canadian government, can we have the guns back for the frigate? Because it's much more useful if it has guns on it. And so, obviously, they weren't buying it to be like a ferry or a pleasure cruise boat or whatever. They were buying it to add to their naval capacity and to increase their military capability. And so, you kind of use funny back and forth between the cabinet and the Canadian government and Argentina or Guatemala or other various Latin American and South American countries. And when Canada refuses to sell them the guns back, and they're like, well, why do you sell us the boat in the first place then? But they get the guns then usually somewhere else and put them on the vessel. Some do get used for commercial purposes, but a lot of them end up in South American militaries, or navies, I guess. As added insurance, they're often sold through American brokers. Knowing that the American State Department could blame Canada for military transfers into South America if they had been completed by U.S. citizens in U.S. jurisdictions. In the word of one Canadian official, quote, we felt that once a Corvette or a Catalina or whatever it might be came into the hands of the United States corporation or company, it became the business of the U.S. authorities to see that such equipment was not sold to undesirable purchasers, end quote. So you're kind of laundering equipment through the U.S. as taking out the actual responsibility for where it eventually ends up. As an example, in September 1945 alone, WAC sold 25 Corvettes to United Ship Corporation in New York, at least 12 of which were immediately just resold to countries in Latin America. And then move on then to my favorite restriction. Oh no, sorry, this is an example once again of this demilitarization. So this happens well into the 50s. There's a really funny story in the late 50s under Diefenbaker, where all of these very highly trained and educated mandarins in external affairs cannot seem to figure out that when they're selling Sherman, when they refuse to sell Sherman tank parts to the Israelis, but are allowing the sale of Sherman tractor parts, that actually Sherman tank parts and Sherman tractor parts are the same parts, and it takes them like 5 years to figure this out, and millions of dollars of Sherbic tractor parts get sent to the Israelis, who are busy using them to manufacture Sherman tanks in a factory in Israel. And this comes as a great shock to everyone involved when it's finally discovered in like 59. And I love this because like, the Sherbic tractor parts are ostensibly demilitarized, and the Sherman tank parts are not, but they're the same part. So demilitarization is a nice label that you put on something, but you know, that's the way we roll in Canada in terms of our demilitarization terminology. My favorite one, which is the offensive versus defensive. So in 1948, Canadian officials began receiving requests for military equipment from Pakistan and India, which had become independent in 1947 and immediately partitioned into two separate states. Now, they were engaged in low-level conflict in the Kashmir, but the dilemma for Canada is that both are members of the Commonwealth. So we have some obligation to be allowing military exports to Commonwealth countries as allies of Canada. However, because they're imminently involved in a conflict with each other, we could be accused of arming both sides, right? If we sold to both of them. So the compromise cabinet decides to put into place is that they are going to allow military exports that are, quote, primarily for use of maintaining internal order in either country, end quote, or rejecting applications for, quote, heavy equipment suitable for extensive military operations, end quote. So this distinction between offensive and defensive equipment becomes very important. They start selling defensive equipment to the Indians and Pakistanis. They won't sell offensive equipment. And this actually becomes an important part of Canadian policy well up into the 90s. So this actually, I think today, is still in use in some press releases that have been released to the government in terms of labs and also other military export controversies in Canada. And the problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to decide, in the most part, what is offensive and what is defensive military equipment. Lester B. Pearson once says, kind of as a joke, that the way he tells whether he's in front of the gun or behind the gun. If he's behind the gun, it's defensive. If he's in front, it's offensive. And he says that like in the 30s. So, but he's also approving. He's very much in favor of this distinction in military policy in Canada in this period. So I'm not quite sure what changed between the 30s and the 50s, or the 40s here, but something did. So, yeah, within a few months, Cabinet drops the restriction even on offensive equipment on sales to Pakistan and India. And during 1949 alone, Canada sells 11 million in military exports to Pakistan, which turns Pakistan into Canada's biggest customer for military equipment of that year, which is a pretty significant sale during that period. And of course, they're involved in the conflict with India. And you know, Canada is worried. All the officials in external affairs are worried that they'll be going to war in a moment. So, we are technically arming both Pakistan and India, Pakistan more than India, but both are being armed by Canada. So conclusions for this section: military export restrictions were often expedients that were used to solve pressing issues. We created the offensive-defensive divide as a means to allow some exports to go to Pakistan and India. They're kind of solutions to other problems. Restrictions are often implemented to enable military exports, and then the policy praxis gap in this period is somewhat the result of interdepartmental rivalry. As I mentioned earlier, C.D. Howe often and WAC really want to be selling military equipment because of the commercial and economic benefits, and often external affairs is arguing against it. So you've got records of arguments in cabinet between, say, St. Laurent from external affairs, and then become as prime minister, and then, say, C.D. Howe from other departments, and then eventually like trade and commerce as well. So moving on to the first Saudi lab sale, I haven't really mentioned, I should go back for a second. So this photo in the corner here, can you spot the difference, offensive lab versus defensive lab? That's a trick question, there actually is no difference. But over the course of the 80s, Canada stops categorizing land armored vehicles as being offensive, and they suddenly become defensive, and that's because there's a lucrative deal on the table to sell labs to our favorite country, Saudi Arabia, which I'll talk about now with the first Saudi lab sale in 1991. This is a very interesting, I think, sale for me. I really like this story because it has a bunch of really kind of cool components to it. This is one of the first major sales to Saudi Arabia. And it happens in 91 because it's been negotiated for almost 10 years prior to this point through several different governments, and it finally comes together in 91, and the deal is inked. And it involves the sale of more than 1,000 light armored vehicles to the Saudi National Guard. It's fascinating for two reasons. First of all, because the deal requires an amendment to a court in the Canadian Criminal Code, it actually requires a bill to be inputted into the House, and the House has to debate this bill publicly. Most of the time in Canada, debates on military export policy happen in smoke-filled rooms, where no one else is really allowed to listen in. Because this debate was happening publicly in the House, it was in all the papers, people were discussing it in public. It was a very different way of debating military export policy in Canada. Second of all, in 1991, especially in the winter and the early spring, we were coming out of a very important historical war, right? Some of you obviously remember this quite well. The Gulf War had just occurred. So this bill was introduced in the House 2 months after the end of the Gulf War. And that also makes it very unfortunately timed. Thirdly, the debates in the House address some of the things we talked about tonight, so much of the key questions in military export policy, so things like, is Saudi Arabia a country in conflict, 1991? Were the labs going to be used to commit human rights violations in Saudi Arabia? And, most importantly, are labs defensive or offensive weapons? I could talk a little bit about the actual criminal code, but I probably won't tonight. So this would be just a little bit about, what the actual bill was meant to address. You see a photo of the bill in the bottom right-hand corner. It's the title page of the bill. And we'll move right on to the terrible timing. So as I said, this bill happens right after the end of the Gulf War. During the Gulf War, after the Gulf War, there's significant blowback against Western military exporters and the arms trade in general, because coalition of states during the Gulf War, coalition of the willing in some cases, had invested a great deal of blood and treasure to defeat a military dictatorship which had been largely armed by exports from the members of the Security Council. When Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army rolled into Kuwait in 1990, it did so with Soviet tanks, French and Chinese aircraft, Brazilian munitions, and other military goods acquired on the international market. And during the Iran-Iraq war in the previous decade, 41 countries had sold an estimated total of $55 billion US in arms to either Iran or Iraq. So the Gulf War was a Western coalition defeating an army that had been armed by members of the Security Council, and in some cases, the Western coalition itself. And during the crisis, our leaders decided to go full proselytizing, sermonizing, holier-than-thou moralism on people once again. So Brian had ridden a very high horse. In early 1991, Brian Mulroney had proclaimed, quote, "The danger to us all of the proliferation of both conventional and non-conventional weapons," quote, warning that, quote, "the world cannot simply return to business as usual." Joe Clark, and his grinning self there on the right side, had told the Calgary Chamber of Commerce that the uncontrolled proliferation of arms into the Middle East was, quote, "insane. It must end. If it does not, if the world continues to treat this region as an auction block and not a tinderbox, we will have failed," quote. These are not the words of men who expected to be defending a massive military export to Saudi Arabia 2 months later. I would contest them. You guys might disagree, but this sounds like they weren't expecting to be doing this. And there were also further systemic obstacles to this arms deal in general. At this point, military export policy in Canada uses this kind of general matrix. We've divided the world up into 3 different countries. Group A is NATO countries and friendly allies. Group B is nations hostile to Canada. Group C is anyone else. And of course, also weapon systems by category: offensive, defensive, and other. And Saudi Arabia, wouldn't you know, is a Group B country that would be receiving offensive weapons. And if you plot the chart across and up, you see a big red X, which means that we would not normally be selling arms or offensive equipment to Saudi Arabia. That'd be a big red X, no. And so we have to work with this in Canada. The deal is very lucrative, and there's a lot of correspondence back and forth from our embassy, our ambassador in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and Ottawa, try to figure out how to square the circle, turn that big X into something else. And originally, people tried to recategorize Saudi Arabia as a Group C country. It doesn't actually work. Saudi Arabia is a little bit too hostile. Then they begin to recategorize labs as non-offensive weapon. It's still a red X, but it's not as red of an X as the top X. And so that does work. Labs are recategorized. And also, I'd argue that in this period, all the correspondence that I have read about this transaction, the potential deal, really emphasizes the economic and commercial benefits of selling a bunch of labs to Saudi Arabia. Very rarely are human rights values or the political consequences actually raised in these internal government documents. Now, Michael Wilson raises the actual bill in the House in '91, and he makes a number of arguments that are just tied to the major restrictions to military export policy. So he first argues that Saudi Arabia is a Canadian ally, and arming them is in our interest. So they are not a Group B country, they actually should be considered a Group A country. During the Gulf War, they were an ally for the Western coalition. He claims that labs are defensive, right? Because of their light armor, as he's saying here, labs are not effective in an offensive role for which heavily armored vehicles, such as main battle tanks, are best suited. And third, he argues that Saudi Arabian human rights violations are part of their, quote, culture, end quote, and would not be perpetrated, with Canadian-made labs. And the last argument he makes is actually about jobs. This is not a great time for the Canadian economy. As many of you know, in 1991, there's a bit of a recession happening. And General Motors had told the government, General Motors makes the labs, that they were going to leave the country, move the subsidiary out of London and just leave if this bill was not approved and this deal was not in. And so Wilson makes a plea that we need to sign this as Canadians, as a government, because otherwise we'll lose a bunch of jobs in London, Ontario, a bunch of manufacturing jobs, and that would destroy the government's influence both in London, Ontario, and also look terrible for them on their economic record. And, I mean, there's a lot of backlash from the NDP and also from, some other people within the party, mostly from John Brewin, who was a prominent NDP leader of the National NDP party at this point in time, and then also David Barrett, and they say numerous things criticizing this bill. I think perhaps my favorite quote is from David Barrett, who says, quote, defensive weapons, talking about the labs, twiddle-dee-dee, twiddle-dee-dum, common known in the streets as BS. I will not go beyond the initials. I don't know what twiddle-dee-dee actually means, but if I was laughing at anyone, I said it once, I was very young, but if I hadn't, I might have known what this means. But tell that to a child who has been shot and killed by an automatic weapon that it was only defensive, end quote, right? And then the problem, though, of course, is that the NDP at this point is a very union-aware party, right? Unions are a big supporter for the NDP, and the union in London, Ontario has come out in support of this deal. So the NDP has to be careful. The Liberals, who created the possibility for the deal when they were still in power in the early 80s, also be very careful, because they were the ones who began talking to the Saudis. And so you've got Joe Fontana here technically supporting the conservative government by telling the NDP that, there are 1.5 million unemployed in this country, and our industries are going down the tubes. That the main argument is about jobs. And as you can probably tell, the bill eventually passes. The job argument cannot be beaten. And the deal is inked. The bill passes, the deal is inked. In 1992, the labs began leaving the country for Saudi Arabia. And as you can see here, there's a significant uptick in the value of military exports to Saudi Arabia after this point. It starts in 92, and then of course the graph is skewed with the fact that 2018 we got this massive export. But all of a sudden, we go from seeing Saudi Arabia and Canada as being a hostile country we shouldn't sell offensive weapons to considering Saudi to be a significant ally that we're going to sell a lot of military equipment to. Now all of that obviously is labs, but a significant amount of that value actually is. So in conclusion here, what is the moral of my story tonight? We've talked about the genesis of export policy, we've talked about the restrictions at play, we've also talked about the first Saudi lab deal. I would say a couple of things. I don't want to give you the impression that Canada does not have a restrictive policy. There are a lot of military export deals that Canada has turned down for various reasons. However, I would say that our restrictions that we have are flexible, more flexible than we usually are told by our government, as they also often are subordinated to commercial and economic considerations. So if the deal is good enough, we tend to say yes, right, on most of these things. restrictions have been broken, they've been eroded, they've been redefined in various ways throughout our history. This continues all the way up until the present day. And I think that, therefore, I'd argue the 2014 lab deal represents the normal operation in some ways of our policy, and not a significant exception and or breakdown in what we as Canada have actually practiced in terms of military export policy. If your exceptions become common and routine enough, then the exceptions become the rule. And in this case, this exception has become the rule. This is an extraordinary deal in terms of the value of the deal, but not in terms of the actual outcome. So thank you very much. That is the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was fascinating and really eye-opening. I want to know if Canada has had, are we any different from any other nations in our export policy? Are we, of our friends, of our allies, NATO allies?
That's one thing I didn't discuss tonight, but on military export policy, unlike a lot of our other, non-economic international policy initiatives, basically during the middle of the 20th century, when the US says jump, we just say how high. So in 48, when the Americans passed their Marshall Plan, and they say, in order to get benefits and value from the Marshall Plan, you have to adopt our military export policies, ergo you can't export any of this value we're giving you to communist countries in Europe. We immediately incorporate all of their export controls into our export policy. We obey almost everything that the US tells us to obey for the entirety of the Cold War. And that's basically because we have a significant economic relationship with the US. They're our biggest exporter, biggest trading partner. They're the biggest customer for military exports in Canada. And we've signed a number of agreements with them, starting with the Hyde Park Declaration in 41, that created a lucrative economic relationship. So we sacrifice military export autonomy often for that. So in terms of how we stand among our peers, Canada, because we are not a major military power in this period, we can be a little bit more discerning in our military export policy, but we essentially mirror American and British policy, mostly American policy, and we are a little more discerning, I would say, but partially because we're not the ones who have to make the tough calls. We're not saying, you know what, we're going to actively support this regime against this communist incursion and arm them to the teeth, because the Americans will do that. We can decide to say yes or no in terms of making that decision. So, yeah, there's a part of what that's missing, which is the fact that there's a huge American influence over what our military export policy is. But I would say that also, we're not unusually bad, we're not unusually good. We're probably gooder, but gooder in this neighborhood is not very good.
Yeah.
You partially answered the question I was going to ask, and that is, have you been able to discern between frick and frack, being the Liberals or the Conservatives, or the Conservatives or Liberals, which, if there's any differentiation in the policy at all between the two parties, or is it pretty much decided by the Democrats and Republicans?
Well, there's a political scientist in Canada, who's at the University of Ottawa at Carleton. His name is Serjan Vucetich, and he has written a paper on this topic. He analyzed a data set of military exports in Canada and tried to decide, are the Liberals more restrictive or are the Conservatives more restrictive? And the conclusion he came to is that he couldn't decide. It was so close. They had almost the same policy. It was really a matter of pronunciation. Now, there have been certain periods where certain regimes have deviated from the norm, right? Diefenbaker actually, and some of his cabinet, Howard Green and Gordon Churchill, who are in cabinet under Diefenbaker, are actually very restrictive and try to get Canada out of the arms trade until they realize that economically, it doesn't make any sense. So they kind of get dragged back in because the Department of Defense production, which is created after the Korean War, during the Korean War, and Minister of Trade and Commerce really want to incentivize arms exports and to expand military exports because of the potential benefits for the military industrial base in Canada. So there's this short period when they're trying to create much more restrictive policy in Canada, and they give up on it. Because the incentives against that are too compelling. That's happened a couple of times, but they're usually short periods, and they can happen because there's a little Liberals, right? But in general, the policies are very similar. It might change, right? We passed things now under the Trudeau regime, 2018, that forced the Minister of External Affairs, so Global Affairs Canada now, to acknowledge things like gender violence or international human rights law that are supposed to be important considerations in military export policy now, but so far it hasn't made a lot of difference, I would say.
I was working for a local company that supplied U.S. military, and I remember in '91 when the Gulf War was on, the panic that went through the company and the U.S. establishment because the Iraqis got on the Saudi border. They could have kept going and got those oil fields. They were horrified. They had to divert divisions to stop the whole, plug the hole. They got with the pants down badly. I think that level of fear is rigid. I mean, anything we can give the Saudis after that, so that I think that's a shockwave right through the whole industry, how vulnerable those oil fields were. Because at the end of the day, those oil field goes down, and then there goes Asia Pacific.
That's the pragmatic argument, right? So there's a reason that we decided that Saudis were now our friends.
Yeah.
And there were compelling geopolitical and strategic reasons for that decision. So I would totally agree with that, right, in terms of understanding why certain decisions were made. But of course, the actual structure of the policy and how it evolved over time shows a remarkable series of critical decisions that I kind of look at and like, like what we are saying we are doing with our policy, what we're actually doing are very different things.
Yeah.
We also forget that during the Gulf War, there was real uncertainty if we could easily defeat the Iraqi army. Because on paper, the Iraqi army at the time was a very formidable military institution.
So just come out of a war, we're very
Just come out of a
trained.
war. Yeah, yeah.
Well, they're elite ones were, but
They'd been blooded, they had a lot of equipment, obviously had been sold during the Iran-Iraq war. The Iraqis were armed by the Americans during that war through a bunch of proxies because they were more worried about the Iranians than the Iraqis.
Yeah.
Obviously, they wanted to diminish Iranian influence, and on paper, the Iraqi military is one of the largest in the world.
it was third largest at that point.
Yeah. So there were reasons why we responded forcibly to that, right?
Yeah.
But also one of the reasons why after the war, everyone said, why are we selling all of this stuff to the Middle East when we intend to spend like $6 billion or $60 billion at the time to be able to arm the coalition, transport the coalition, and win the war? Right?
Yeah, you could smell the fear.
Yeah.
It was palpable at work. Everybody was just losing it.
Yeah. That's good to know. Actually, I appreciate that because obviously I was quite young at the time.
In terms of Canada, in relation to the world at this time you're referring to, how did we stack up in terms of our numbers versus the rest of the world?
Oh man, the numbers question is very hard. And the numbers question is hard because it's very difficult to get accurate numbers on the arms trade in general, even today. Although certain institutions like the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Research, or the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute, does a really good job creating a database for international arms trade from about 1950 onwards. But from 45 to 50, a lot of stuff gets transferred after the war, and there are very few records of it. So Canada becomes a really important seller of military equipment to, say, Pakistan in 49. It becomes a really important seller to the Dutch in the early 40s. There are periods where Canada's an influential seller to other nations, and often on certain munitions. Like when it comes to those Sherman tractor parts, we have a monopoly on the sale of the Sherman tank parts, really, to both Pakistan and India during the 50s. And we're a major supplier to Israel because of a company in Canada called Levy Auto Parts, which is like the premier recycler of these types of parts during that period. But in terms of what our ranking is in arms traders globally during this period, there's a huge drop-off after you get through the top five, right? So the US, the UK, Czechoslovakia, France, and I guess Germany's had a question about maybe a little bit of Italy. And then so we're probably a top 10 supplier in the 50s, maybe a top 7 or 8 supplier in the 40s, because of that point we are a major, most of those countries are buying and we're still selling, because most of the European countries at that point have their infrastructure destroyed by the Second World War, so they are rebuilding. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, Canada is like a top, I mean, they got a 15 or 16. But that's a misleading number because the top two are like 60% of the arms trade globally, right? The US and the USSR, and everyone else kind of filling the cracks underneath that.
And just a follow-up, were you able to find out in your research any of the unofficial arms trade deals that may have occurred in Canada?
Well, I think that like there's a bit of a misconception because obviously today we hear a lot about the private arms sellers, like the guys who are flying around with like a bunch of AK-47s in the Seattle Supersonics jet, like, flying to Tunisia or visiting Charles Taylor in Liberia and selling him stuff. And those are great stories, but those represent a very small portion of the arms trade. Most of the arms trade is government approved. It comes with military export permits. It's traveling around the world based upon the sales ventures and efforts of government officials. The unofficial stuff in Canada, there's a lot of interesting half stories where you get a couple of like government memos about a certain question or a certain kind of sale. So attempts by a certain gentleman out of Britain to reroute the sale of guns from Canada to the UK to Israel through 3 other states and then to, I don't know, some Soviet authority or whatever. Get some of that, right? Get stories about guys who end up flying airplanes from Canada into Europe. They end up landing in a small field somewhere, and then all of a sudden they have a suspicious accent. I'll take it from here. Hands you a bag of cash and takes the airplane and flies it over somewhere else, presumably behind the Iron Curtain. That kind of stuff does occur. There's a story, another very famous arms dealer, the kind of Sir Basil Zaharoff of his era, who's Samuel Cummings of International Arms Co. He has an office in Canada. He's a very famous private arms dealer. And he does, well, his company, Canada International Arms Co., does a number of sales out of Canada. But the government finally says, like, who is applying for these permits? They go knock on the door of the office in Montreal where Inter Arms Co. is ostensibly based and find that there's no one there. No neighborhood's heard of International Arms Co. And all the people who were ostensibly the board of directors of this company don't actually exist. So he was using Canada kind of as a front. Like it was a shell corporation for other arms deals, like using transshipment to reroute stuff through Canada before it went to somewhere else. So you discover stories like that. And the government, is concerned about them. They don't want their reputation nationally of being like a good destination for arms dealers. It doesn't really help your reputation. So they cut down on that pretty fast. There are a lot of stories about that. And they're playing a bit of a cat and mouse game from the 50s and 60s where they have to keep revising the Export and Import Permits Act to give the government the authority to prevent like brokering or smuggling or transshipment or the use of permits to like send stuff to like West Germany or something that's kind of rerouted on to Austria or something. So there are stories, but I don't think a ton of equipment gets moved around that way.
Thank you.
I think that's all the questions. Thank you once more.
You didn't go anywhere near the U.S. stuff during the Vietnam War, though.
No. Well, technically, my period is up from 45 to 1960.
Yeah.
I talked a little bit about the lab stuff at the end, because I was interested in that topic specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Vietnam stuff. There are guys who cover that, and you may have read some of their stuff, and it is an interesting story as well, because you have stories of like Canadian officials, and we have military producers in Canada who are supplying the U.S. military for use in Vietnam. But because of the fear of public censure and also criticism, the Canadian government won't allow military equipment to be sent directly from Canada to Vietnam. So instead, these military producers in Canada write to officials in the government saying, like, we have to get our product from here in Montreal or here in London, Ontario to Vietnam. What do you want us to do? And they prefer that it goes to an American destination first once again, so they can kind of blame it on the Americans. But there are times when the government writes back and kind of helpfully gives advice on how to evade Canadian military export controls, which is weird.
Actually, one last question, if it's okay with you. You mentioned before there's a gap in between what perhaps is written and what is communicated to people. How often or how large is this, how can we call it, miscommunication perhaps, from between what's being put into paper and what is being discussed and actually what ends up being taught to the public in general as a concept.
Well, I mean, as you know, like politics is politics. So why a decision is made and why they tell you it's made are often very different things, right? So we call that political spin. So you get a lot of documents where different government officials, even ministers, are trying to brainstorm how to break the news to the public or how to evade public criticism, right? And so you get funny stories of that nature where like they're kind of collaborating about how to kind of either confuse, delude, or mislead the public. And that does occur, but there also are times the government is actually remarkably transparent on certain things, right? In 1991, right, in this final Saudi deal, Canada becomes one of the first nations to start publishing an annual report on military exports from Canada, which is based upon this transparency initiative at the UN that certain Canadians are helping to orchestrate. So Ernie Regier, who's a famous Canadian military export policy researcher from Project Plowshares at the University of Waterloo. You've heard of Project Plowshares maybe, it's a very important research institute in Canada. He actually goes to as part of this panel of experts talking about creating what we now call UNROCA, or the UN Register of Conventional Arms, which is an attempt to get all these countries to give a report every year to the UN about what they're selling and why, or to who, sorry, and put it all together into a big database for the UN to put up on their websites and all their publications. And Canada is an early adopter. We put out a report of our own every year, and we have almost every year since. Harper may have missed a couple of years. And that's a pretty remarkable initiative in some ways. So, as always with these things, you have some examples of not nefarious behavior, but deceptive behavior, and some examples of things that actually are kind of remarkable, right? But I would say overall, there is a sense that in public, the statements made by Canadian officials and ministers really highlight the restrictiveness of our policy, our virtuous sense of human rights criteria, and how little we actually sell, right? Like how meaningless it is in the larger scope of how much the Americans, how much the British sell. And then in public, the considerations are often things like, how much money are we making? Will this company go under if it doesn't get this deal, right? Are they paying us in American dollars or in, some other worthless currency? So there's a point in 48 when we sell a bunch of military aircraft to the Chinese nationalists, despite having already said that we're actually going to have an embargo on further sales to the nationalists. And Stevie Howe basically overrules St. Laurent. They have to put up kind of like this press release being like, this is an exception to our policy, and we're only doing it because the money is too good to say no. That's like an actual statement. That is
Right. Thank you very much.
Oh, I thought I saw in one of your pictures that the article in the Claims was written by George Drew, who's a Guelph guy.
Oh, is
Yeah,
Well,
he was
I didn't know
mayor,
that.
councillor, mayor in Guelph, premier of the province, head of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Wow. Well, that George Drew. Okay.
That George Drew. So that, I'm wondering how many George Drews are there that
the
are,
same guy?
yeah, ultra conservative like that, so I'm thinking it's probably not the George Drew.
There's a series of articles that he writes. He makes a name for himself as a writer
Yeah,
on this topic, military exports and the salacious tales about these arms dealers.
that would be our connection.
Okay.
So, we don't have a military lecture in December, because it gets a little too close to Christmas, but we do have, next Saturday, we're having a John McCrae Symposium. So, all day Saturday on the 26th, from 10 till 4, we have lectures and talks on John McCrae from Tim Cook, who many of you know, who's from the War Museum in Ottawa and written numerous books on Canadian military. To Linda Granfield, who's an expert on John McCrae, Bev Dietrich, who is a former curator and who's been transcribing John's letters. It's just going to be a great day. So it's all day. There isn't a fee. It's $40 for the day. But we do provide snacks. Don't forget, there are snacks. So if you want to book, you can book tickets through Eventbrite on our website. And our next lecture is Megan Hamilton, and she's talking on men and morale, Canadian Army training in the Second World War, and that's in January 19th. So that'll be our next Laureate lecture. So thank you all for coming out tonight on this cold night, and hopefully we'll see you next week or in January.